I was holding the phone in my hand when the picture appeared, and for a moment I thought my eyes were tired, that they were playing tricks on me the way they sometimes do late in the evening. The screen showed bright blue water, a wide smile, and a familiar face wearing sunglasses far too large for her cheeks. My daughter-in-law, standing on a beach. I sat very still, listening to the low hum of the refrigerator behind me, waiting for the image to make sense. It did not. Only a few hours earlier, I had signed papers at the hospital desk with a pen that barely worked, my name written slowly, carefully, because my hands were aching. The nurse had thanked me for taking care of the billing. She had called me a good mother. I remember nodding because it seemed easier than speaking. Now I stared at the photo, my thumb resting against the edge of the phone, and felt something quiet split open inside my chest. I did not cry. I did not gasp. I simply sat there, breathing in shallow, measured breaths, as if any deeper breath might cause something to spill out that I was not ready to clean up. I had opened the credit card 3 days before. It was not something I had planned for long. I had sat in the hospital corridor with its pale walls and flickering lights, watching people pass with tired faces and paper cups of coffee. James was asleep behind a thin curtain, machines whispering beside him. The doctor had explained the treatment options in a calm, practiced voice, and when he reached the part about costs, he hesitated just slightly. That hesitation told me everything. I remember thinking that numbers could be dealt with later, that a mother should not be counting dollars when her son was counting breaths. When the bank clerk asked me if I understood the interest rate, I said yes, even though I only half listened. I was thinking about James as a boy, about how he used to hold my finger when he crossed the street. Signing my name felt like the smallest thing I could do. That evening, when I returned home, the house greeted me with its familiar silence. The door creaked the way it always has, a sound that used to annoy me but now feels like proof that something here still remembers me. I took off my shoes slowly, lining them up by the wall. The smell of hospital disinfectant clung to my sweater, sharp and stubborn. I hung my purse on the back of the chair and stood for a moment, letting the quiet settle. Then I saw the suitcase near the sofa. It was not mine. It was new, smooth, with a hard shell that caught the light. Before I could wonder too much, she walked in, light-footed, as if the floor existed only to support her entrance. Chloe looked rested. That was the first thing I noticed. Her skin glowed in a way that comes from sun and leisure, not from sleep stolen in short hours on a hospital chair. She wore a dress that shimmered slightly when she moved, and her hair fell neatly over her shoulders, untouched by worry. She did not ask about James. She smiled at her phone, adjusting the angle, stepping closer to the window for better light. I stood there, my hands still on the chair, feeling older than I had that morning. When I finally spoke her name, my voice sounded thin to my own ears. She glanced at me briefly, her eyes sliding away almost at once, as if I were a piece of furniture she had already memorized. "Hawaii," she said, when I asked where she had been. Just that one word. She said it the way one might say the grocery store. She sat down, crossed her legs, and laughed softly at something on her screen. The house felt suddenly too small, as if her laughter had pushed the walls closer. I thought of James lying still, of the steady beep of machines, and I wondered how two worlds could exist at the same time without touching. She talked about the water, about the weather, about how nice it felt to get away. I nodded when it seemed appropriate. Years of quiet endurance teach you when to nod. It was when she reached into her bag that my attention sharpened. She pulled out a card, gold and clean, and held it between her fingers like a token. The light caught its surface, and for a second it looked almost beautiful. She extended it toward me, not offering it back, just showing it. "Thanks," she said casually. "I used your card." There was no apology in her tone, no hesitation. She mentioned an amount, laughing as if it were a joke, a number too large to be real. I remember smiling then, not because it was funny, but because my mind could not immediately accept what I was hearing. I told her calmly that the card had a limit, even corrected myself gently as if I was the one mistaken. She shrugged, already bored with the conversation, and turned her attention back to her phone. That night, after she went to bed, I sat alone at the kitchen table. The phone lay face up in front of me, the beach photo still open. I enlarged it slowly, noticing small details. The curve of her smile, the drink in her hand, the ease in her posture. I tried to match that image with the memory of James that morning, pale against white sheets. My chest felt tight, but my face remained dry. I have lived long enough to know that tears do not always come when they are expected. Sometimes they wait. I turned the phone face down and folded my hands together, feeling the thin skin, the faint tremor. I told myself that there must be an explanation. There is almost always an explanation, I thought. Still, when I finally turned off the light and lay down, sleep did not come easily. The ceiling above me seemed unfamiliar, and in the dark the quiet felt heavier than before, as if it were holding its breath, waiting for something else to be revealed. Morning arrived without ceremony, the way it often does now, slipping in through the thin curtains and resting on the table before I was ready to face it. I had not slept much, my body lay still, but my thoughts kept moving, circling the same quiet questions without answers. When I finally got up, the house felt different, not louder or darker, just slightly off, like a picture hung a little crooked on the wall. I made tea and stood by the sink, watching steam rise, reminding myself to breathe slowly. Chloe was still asleep, her door was closed, and from behind it came the faint hum of something electronic, perhaps her phone charging, perhaps music I could not hear clearly. I did not knock. I told myself there would be time later, though I did not know what that time would be for. The hospital was calling me back, and I needed to return before noon. James would be waking soon, and I wanted to be there when he opened his eyes, because sometimes he looked around first, confused, and I wanted him to see me and not feel alone. At the hospital, the air felt cooler than the day before, or maybe I was simply more aware of it. James smiled faintly when he saw me, a small effort that seemed to cost him more than he wanted to admit. I adjusted his blanket and asked about his pain in the same calm tone I had practiced over the years, the one that never suggests panic. He asked me if everything was all right at home. I said yes. It was not a lie exactly, just a postponement. We spoke about ordinary things, about the weather, about a neighbor's dog he used to like. When the nurse came in with a clipboard, she mentioned the account again, confirming the card on file. I nodded and thanked her. The numbers did not come up, and I did not bring them up either. I sat with James until he drifted back to sleep, then I walked the long hallway alone, past windows that showed a city moving on without us. On my way out, I stopped at the small cafe near the entrance. I did not want coffee, but I bought one anyway, holding the warm cup between my palms as if it could steady me. I took out my phone and looked at the beach photo again. This time, I noticed the timestamp. It had been taken 2 days earlier. I did not know why that detail mattered, but it lodged itself in my mind. I thought about the day I had spent filling out forms, the way the bank clerk had asked me if the card was for emergencies only. I had said yes, of course. I had meant it. I wondered how the word emergency could stretch to include clear water and bright skies. I put the phone away and threw the coffee into the trash untouched. Some comforts feel wrong when they arrive too easily. Back at the house that evening, Chloe was awake and dressed, moving through the rooms as if preparing to leave again. She spoke to me about a dinner invitation, about people whose names I did not recognize. Her voice was light, practiced, never lingering on anything that might slow it down. I listened, responding when necessary, though my thoughts were elsewhere. At one point, she mentioned needing to stop by a store, and I nodded again. It occurred to me then how much nodding I had done in my life, how many small agreements I had made without fully understanding their cost. When she finally left, the house exhaled. I sat in the living room and looked around, noticing dust in corners I had ignored, a faint scratch on the table where James once dragged a toy truck. These details felt grounding, solid in a way that recent events did not. Later that night, I gathered my papers. I did not know exactly what I was looking for, only that my hands needed to be busy. I found the credit card agreement folded neatly in an envelope, the terms printed in small, serious letters. I read them slowly, line by line, my finger tracing the margins. The limit was clear, the conditions were clear. Nothing on that page suggested flexibility. I set the papers down and stared at them for a long time, listening to the clock in the hallway mark each passing minute. I thought about calling the bank then, but something stopped me. Perhaps it was fatigue, perhaps it was a need to understand more before speaking. I have learned that words, once spoken, cannot be taken back, and I was not ready to choose mine. The days that followed settled into a strange rhythm: hospital in the mornings, quiet house in the evenings. Chloe came and went, her presence brief and bright, like a reflection passing across glass. She did not mention the card again, and neither did I. James asked for her once, wondering if she was resting. I told him she was busy. He nodded, accepting this without question, the way sons sometimes do. Watching him trust so easily made something tighten inside me, but I kept my voice steady. At night, I began to notice how often Chloe's phone chimed, how frequently she stepped outside to take calls. These were small things, easily dismissed, yet they accumulated in my mind, forming a weight I could not ignore. One evening, as I washed dishes, I caught my reflection in the window. The lines on my face seemed deeper than I remembered, my eyes more watchful. I wondered when I had become someone who noticed so much and said so little. I dried my hands and picked up my phone again, scrolling past the photo this time, opening the banking app instead. The screen loaded slowly, and for a moment I hoped it might fail, that I would be spared whatever waited on the other side. When the numbers finally appeared, they did not make sense at first. I blinked and looked again, leaning closer as if distance were the problem. The balance was far beyond what I expected, beyond what I believed possible. I sat down heavily, the chair scraping softly against the floor. My heart did not race, it slowed. In that quiet slowing, I felt the first true certainty settle in. Something had been done without me, something that could not be explained away with carelessness or misunderstanding. I locked the phone, set it face down, and rested my hands on the table. The house was silent, but beneath that silence, I sensed a movement, like the first shift before a long, unavoidable change. The next morning brought a letter. It was slipped halfway under the door, its corner bent, as if it had been pushed in without care. I noticed it only because I nearly stepped on it while putting on my shoes. The envelope was thick, heavier than it needed to be, with elegant writing on the front. My name was spelled correctly, which surprised me more than it should have. I carried it to the table and sat down before opening it, because something about its weight made me cautious. Inside was an invitation, cream-colored, the kind of paper that feels smooth under your fingers. It announced a celebration, a formal gathering, names printed in graceful script. James and Chloe. A renewal of vows, it said, a way to mark their love publicly, surrounded by family and friends. There was a date circled lightly in pencil, as if someone had already decided for me that I would be there. For a moment, I allowed myself a small, quiet hope. I imagined James standing straighter, healthier, smiling the way he used to. I imagined Chloe beside him, attentive, perhaps changed. Hope is a strange thing. It can appear even when you have not invited it. I folded the invitation carefully and placed it back in its envelope, telling myself that perhaps this was her way of making amends, of including me. I did not mention the invitation to James right away. He was still recovering, and I wanted to choose the right moment. I told myself there was no harm in waiting. At the hospital, James seemed brighter that day. He spoke about the future in small, careful sentences, about work he might return to, about plans he had put aside. I listened, nodding, encouraging him gently. When he asked if Chloe had mentioned anything important, I hesitated only briefly before saying no. The truth felt complicated, tangled, and I was not ready to pull at it yet. On my way home, I stopped at the grocery store and bought things we did not need, filling the cart as if abundance might smooth over what felt sharp inside me. I cooked that evening, filling the house with the smell of warm food, an old habit that brought some comfort. Chloe arrived late, distracted, complimented the meal without really tasting it. She mentioned the event then, casually, as if it were a detail already settled. "You'll come, of course," she said, not looking at me. I nodded again, feeling that familiar motion of agreement settle into my shoulders. The days leading up to the event passed quickly. James was discharged, still weak but eager to be home. I prepared the spare room for him, smoothing sheets, placing his things where he could reach them. Chloe was busy with arrangements, phone pressed to her ear, laughter spilling into rooms she barely entered. Once I overheard her speaking about costs, about venues, about expectations. I did not hear concern in her voice, only impatience. At night, I lay awake, the invitation on my bedside table, its presence steady and undeniable. I thought about the balance on the card, about the numbers I had seen, and wondered how all these pieces fit together. I told myself again that there would be time to ask questions later. The day of the event arrived clear and bright. I dressed carefully, choosing a simple outfit, one I had worn before on occasions that mattered. I pinned my hair back, studying my reflection longer than usual. I wanted to look composed, not because I felt it, but because I believed it was expected of me. The venue was large, impressive, filled with light and sound. Music played softly, voices overlapped, laughter echoed against high ceilings. When James entered, leaning slightly on my arm, several people turned to look, offering polite smiles, words of admiration. I felt a quiet pride then, seeing him standing there, alive, present. Chloe moved through the crowd with ease. She greeted people warmly, accepted compliments, posed for photographs. When she reached us, she kissed James lightly and gave me a brief smile, one that did not quite reach her eyes. She introduced me to others as James's mother, nothing more. I stood beside them, hands folded, listening as stories were told, as jokes were shared. More than once, someone mentioned how generous Chloe had been, how beautifully everything had been arranged. I smiled when appropriate, though my stomach felt tight. At one point, a woman I did not know leaned toward me and thanked me for helping make the event possible. "It must mean so much to support them like this," she said kindly. I nodded, my ears ringing slightly, as if the room had shifted. Later, when speeches began, I sat quietly at the edge of my chair. Chloe spoke with confidence, her voice carrying easily. She thanked friends, sponsors, people who had believed in them. She did not mention the hospital or the nights James had spent in pain. She did not look at me. When applause filled the room, it felt distant, muffled, like sound heard underwater. I glanced at James. He was smiling, though there was a tiredness in his eyes that worried me. I placed my hand briefly over his, a small anchor, and he squeezed it back. As the evening went on, I noticed whispers. Conversations paused when I approached, resumed when I moved away. Once I caught my own name spoken softly, followed by a glance in my direction. No one said anything directly to me, but the air felt charged, uncomfortable. I excused myself and went to the restroom, locking the door behind me. The mirror reflected a woman who looked calm, if a little pale. I took a deep breath and told myself that appearances can deceive, that not everything felt is meant to be understood immediately. When I returned to the hall, I found Chloe laughing with a small group, her hand gesturing animately. As I drew closer, her laughter faded, replaced by a tight smile. She turned toward me, her voice carrying just enough to be heard. "You look tired," she said lightly. "These events can be a lot, especially when you're not used to them. A few people smiled awkwardly. Heat rose to my face, but I kept my expression neutral. I told her I was fine. She nodded, already turning away, the moment dismissed. That night, after we returned home, James fell asleep quickly, exhausted. I sat alone in the living room, the sounds of the event still echoing faintly in my mind. I replayed the words I had heard, the looks I had seen, the way my presence seemed both acknowledged and erased. I reached for my phone, not to check messages, but to steady myself with something concrete. The numbers were still there, unchanged, undeniable. I set the phone down and leaned back, closing my eyes. The invitation, the smiles, the whispers, all blended together, forming a single heavy question. I did not know yet how it would be answered, only that it would not disappear on its own. The days after the event felt quieter than before, as if the house itself were recovering from having held so many unspoken things at once. James slept often. His body was still healing, and I encouraged the rest, bringing him water, sitting nearby when he was awake. Chloe, on the other hand, seemed energized, buoyed by the success of the celebration. She spoke about it repeatedly, recounting compliments, replaying moments that made her smile. I listened when I was in the room, though my attention drifted. I found myself watching instead, noticing how she moved, how she avoided certain subjects with practiced ease. When James mentioned the hospital, her responses were brief, efficient, as if that chapter were already closed. One afternoon, while James slept, I stood by the window and watched Chloe load boxes into her car. They were labeled with the names of boutiques and caterers. She handled them carefully, checking lists on her phone, lips moving silently as she counted. The sight of those boxes stirred something inside me, not anger exactly, but a dull pressure, like a bruise touched too often. I thought about the credit card again, about how quickly the balance had grown. I had not told James. Each time I considered it, I saw his face at the hospital, pale and uncertain, and I chose silence. I told myself that mothers sometimes carry things so their children do not have to. Later that evening, Chloe sat across from me at the kitchen table, scrolling through photos from the event. She turned the screen toward me occasionally, pointing out details, laughing softly. I nodded, offering small acknowledgments. At one point, she paused on an image where the two of them stood beneath bright lights, smiling widely. "We look good," she said. I agreed. They did. Good can be very convincing when seen from the right angle. She then mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that some payments were still processing, that these things take time. Her tone was casual, unconcerned. I asked which payments she meant. She waved a hand lightly. "Oh, you know, everything." The word everything settled heavily between us. I did not press further. I had begun to understand that questions asked too early often lead nowhere. That night, sleep came in short stretches. I woke once to the sound of Chloe's phone vibrating, then again to the soft click of her door closing. The house seemed full of movement, even when no one was speaking. In the early hours, I got up and made tea, sitting at the table with the lights off, letting the dark hold me. I thought about my life before all this, about years marked by routine and responsibility. I had always believed that if you did your part quietly, things would balance out on their own. Lately, that belief felt thin. The next morning, a call came from the bank. I recognized the number immediately, though I had been expecting it without admitting so. The woman on the line spoke politely, professionally, explaining that there were unusual charges on my account. She asked if I could confirm them. I listened, my free hand resting flat on the table. I said yes, I recognized the card. I did not say I recognized the purchases. There was a pause, just long enough to feel. She explained that because the card was in good standing, the charges had gone through. She suggested reviewing the statement carefully. I thanked her and ended the call. My reflection in the dark screen looked calm, almost distant. Inside, something had shifted, like a door closing softly but firmly. I printed the statements that afternoon. The printer hummed steadily, page after page sliding out, each line a small record of something done without me. restaurants, hotels, boutiques, event services. Dates overlapped with hospital visits, times when I had been sitting beside James, holding his hand. I stacked the pages neatly, aligning the corners because order felt important. As I read, I did not rush. I wanted to see everything clearly. By the end, my hands were steady. The confusion that had clouded the early days had thinned, replaced by a quiet understanding that left little room for doubt. When Chloe came home that evening, she found the papers on the table. She stopped short, her expression shifting briefly before smoothing out. She asked what they were. I told her they were statements. She laughed lightly, said something about paperwork always looking worse than it is. I asked her to sit. She did, crossing her arms, impatience flickering across her face. I pointed to a line, then another, not accusing, simply indicating. I asked her if she remembered these charges. Her answers were vague, dismissive. She spoke of investments, of future returns, of sacrifices made now for later comfort. I listened until she finished. Then I asked her if she thought I should have been told. Her eyes hardened slightly. "It's family money," she said. "We're all benefiting." The words hung in the air. Family money. I thought about the house, about years of careful saving, about choices made and not made. I thought about James, sleeping in the next room, trusting both of us. I told her quietly that the card was opened for medical bills. She shrugged, as if the distinction were minor. "Things change," she said. "You should be proud you can help." Pride was not what I felt. I felt something closer to clarity, sharp and unwelcome. The conversation ended without resolution. She stood, collected her phone, and left the room, already distracted by something else. I gathered the papers and placed them back in their folder. That night, as I lay in bed, I realized I was no longer waiting for an explanation. I had heard enough to know what was missing. The silence between us was no longer empty. It was full, dense with meaning. I stared at the ceiling, listening to the house settle, and understood that whatever came next would not be accidental. Something had been set in motion, and though I had not named it yet, I could feel it moving steadily toward me, asking to be answered. After that night, I stopped asking questions out loud. Not because I no longer had them, but because I understood their answers would only circle back to the same place. The house returned to its routines, or something like them. James improved slowly, measuring progress in small victories, walking to the window without resting, eating a full meal, smiling without effort. I focused on these moments, letting them anchor my days. Chloe moved around us with efficiency, her presence brief and polished, her attention divided among calls, messages, and plans that did not include me. We existed in the same space, but not in the same story. I learned to listen more closely, not in an obvious way, not with suspicion written on my face, but quietly, the way one listens to weather before deciding whether to carry an umbrella. I noticed how Chloe spoke to people on the phone, the tone she used when she thought no one could hear. I noticed how often she asked for documents, passwords, access, always framed as convenience, never as necessity. I gave little answers when needed, delayed when I could. Delay became a kind of language for me, one I had not used before. It felt unfamiliar, but also protective. During the afternoons, when James rested, I began sorting through old files, not with urgency, but with patience. I told myself I was organizing for the future, simplifying things. In truth, I was reacquainting myself with my own life. Papers have a way of reminding you who you were when you signed them. Deeds, statements, letters folded so many times the creases softened. I handled them carefully, laying them out, reading dates, names, margins. There was comfort in their order. They did not rush me. They waited. Sometimes, as I worked, I felt a quiet sadness, not for the money, not even for the betrayal, but for the years I had spent believing that love meant never needing to look too closely. I thought of how often I had stepped aside to keep peace, how often I had accepted explanations because they were easier than disagreement. These reflections did not make me angry, they made me attentive. Attention, I realized, is something you can reclaim at any age. Chloe noticed the changes, though she did not name them. She commented once that I seemed busy lately. I smiled and said I was catching up on things I had put off. She laughed and said there was no rush. Her confidence rested on the assumption that nothing fundamental had shifted. That assumption gave her ease. I did not correct it. I have learned that people reveal themselves most clearly when they believe they are safe from consequence. One evening, James asked me if everything was all right between Chloe and me. His voice was gentle, careful, as if he were stepping onto thin ice. I told him yes, that we were just tired. He accepted this, though his eyes lingered on my face, searching. I reached out and squeezed his hand, grounding us both. I wanted to protect him from what I was beginning to understand, not because he could not face it, but because timing matters. Healing bodies need quiet. I decided then that whatever I carried, I would carry without placing it on his chest. As weeks passed, the bank statements continued to arrive. I opened them alone, always at the same time of day, after lunch, when the house was still. I read them carefully, then placed them in a folder, one on top of the other. The folder grew thicker, heavier. Each page confirmed what I already knew, but seeing it laid out brought a strange calm. Facts have that effect. They reduce the noise. I stopped imagining alternative explanations. I stopped hoping for misunderstandings. Hope had done its part. Now it stepped aside. I also began making small changes that would not be noticed all at once. Updating contact information, redirecting mail, reviewing agreements that had not been touched in years. None of it felt dramatic, it felt practical, overdue. I moved through these tasks quietly, without announcing them, without seeking approval. There was a steadiness in this work that surprised me. I had always thought strength arrived loudly with declarations. Instead, it came like this, measured and private. Chloe grew impatient in subtle ways. She complained about delays, about things taking longer than expected. Once she asked me directly if there was a problem with the card. I met her eyes and told her the bank was reviewing some activity. It was the truth, though not the whole of it. She frowned, then waved it off, already thinking of something else. That dismissal told me more than any argument could have. It confirmed that our understandings of responsibility did not align. At night, when the house slept, I lay awake and listened, not for sounds, but for my own thoughts. They were no longer tangled. They lined up, one after another, clear and patient. I did not plan in the way people imagine planning. There were no speeches rehearsed, no confrontations envisioned. There was only a growing sense that silence, which had once been my refuge, had reached its limit. Silence can protect, but it can also preserve what harms you. Knowing when to let it go is a kind of wisdom that comes slowly. One morning, as I watered the small plants by the window, I caught my reflection again. I looked the same, perhaps a little thinner, a little more tired, but something in my eyes had changed. They no longer searched the room for approval. They rested where they were. That steadiness felt unfamiliar and comforting at all once. I finished watering, set the can down, and went to check on James. He smiled at me, and in that smile I felt a quiet resolve settle deeper. I did not know exactly how or when things would surface, only I knew they would. Truth has a way of moving forward once it is given room. As I folded the statements and placed them back in the folder, I understood that what I was doing now was not waiting, it was preparing, though not for a confrontation, not for revenge. It was preparing to stand where I had always stood, but this time with my eyes open, ready to let the weight of what was real finally fall where it belonged. Time moved differently then. Days passed, but they did not blur together the way they once had. Each one felt deliberate, marked by small actions that mattered only because I noticed them. James regained strength slowly. He began sitting at the table again, reading the paper, asking about ordinary things. His voice sounded more like himself. Watching him return to the world reminded me why I had stayed quiet for so long. Love can make silence feel like duty. I still believed that, but I was beginning to understand its limits. Chloe became more restless. Her movements were sharper, her patience thinner. She complained openly about expenses, about people who did not follow through, about systems that made things complicated for no reason. Sometimes she directed these comments toward me, sometimes she did not bother. When I did not respond the way she expected, she grew irritated, then distracted. I noticed how easily her attention shifted, how little space she left for reflection. That, too, was a kind of answer. I continued my routines: hospital follow-ups with James, short walks in the afternoon, evenings spent at home reading or sorting papers. Nothing I did looked unusual from the outside. That was important. I had learned over the years that sudden changes invite questions, and I was not ready for questions yet. Instead, I let consistency become my shield. People rarely examine what appears steady. The folder of statements now had a place of its own, tucked away where it would not be stumbled upon. I did not revisit it often. I did not need to. The facts were already settled in my mind. What occupied me more were the smaller details, the ones that rarely get attention: dates, signatures, patterns. I began to see how things connected, how access led to assumption, how assumption led to entitlement. None of this surprised me anymore. It simply clarified what had been unfolding quietly for some time. One afternoon, I received a call from someone whose name I recognized but had not heard in years. The conversation was brief, polite, professional. I listened more than I spoke. When the call ended, I sat for a long moment with the phone in my hand, feeling the weight of what had just been confirmed. It was not dramatic news. It was precise. Precision has a way of settling the nerves. I placed the phone down and went to check on James, who was napping peacefully. His steady breathing grounded me. I reminded myself again that whatever steps I took would be taken carefully, without haste. Chloe began asking more pointed questions. She wanted timelines. She wanted assurances. She wanted me to move faster on things I had no intention of rushing. When I answered calmly, she mistook it for agreement. That misunderstanding worked in my favor. There is a particular kind of freedom in being underestimated. It allows you to move without interference. At dinner one night, she spoke openly about future plans, about relocating, about investments that would benefit everyone. James listened quietly, nodding when appropriate. I watched him closely, noting when his expression shifted, when uncertainty crept in. I intervened gently, changing the subject, steering the conversation toward something neutral. Chloe looked sharply at me for a moment, then smiled. The smile did not reach her eyes. It did not need to. I had already seen what lay behind it. Later that evening, after James had gone to bed, Chloe sat across from me and asked if I trusted her. The question felt rehearsed. I took a moment before answering, not because I needed time to think, but because I wanted my response to be exact. I told her trust was built over time, through care and honesty. She laughed softly and said I worried too much. She reached for her phone, the conversation already over in her mind. I watched her go, noting how quickly she dismissed what did not serve her. In the quiet that followed, I felt something settle into place. Not anger, not sadness, a kind of acceptance. Acceptance does not mean approval. It means seeing clearly without flinching. I had reached that point. The days of hoping for a different explanation were behind me. In their place was a steady awareness, one that did not demand immediate action but did not allow retreat. I began writing things down. Not plans, not strategies, observations, dates, words spoken, moments that might otherwise blur or be dismissed. I wrote them in a plain notebook, in my own handwriting, slowly and carefully. Writing has always helped me think. Seeing the ink on paper made the situation feel contained, manageable. It reminded me that memory can be selective, but records are patient. As I wrote, I thought about the future, not in grand terms, not about outcomes. I thought about what it would feel like to live without this weight pressing on my chest, to wake up without calculating what should or should not be said, to move through my own home without bracing myself. That vision was quiet, almost modest, but it felt worth moving toward. Chloe's behavior grew bolder. She spoke more openly on the phone, assuming privacy even when it was not guaranteed. She referred to things as already decided, as if stating them made them so. I listened without reacting. Reaction is what she expected. Reaction would have given her something to push against. Instead, I offered calm. Calm can be disarming when someone is looking for resistance. James, meanwhile, began to notice the tension, though he did not name it. He asked once if something was wrong. I told him we were adjusting. He nodded, trusting me. That trust sat heavy on my shoulders, but it also strengthened my resolve. I would not let him be caught in the middle of something he did not create. Whatever unfolded would unfold with care. One evening, as I closed the notebook and placed it beside the folder, I felt a sense of readiness that surprised me. Not readiness to act, but readiness to allow things to surface. There is a difference. I no longer felt the need to control the timing, to force clarity. The groundwork had been laid. The pieces were in place, though not yet visible to anyone else. I turned off the light and stood in the doorway for a moment listening to the house settle into sleep. It sounded the same as always. That steadiness reassured me. Change does not always announce itself with noise. Sometimes it arrives quietly, already formed, waiting only for the right moment to be seen. The call came on an ordinary afternoon, the kind that does not prepare you for anything important. I was at the table, sorting mail, separating what needed attention from what could wait. When I saw the number, I felt no rush of fear, only a quiet recognition. I answered and listened. The voice on the other end was measured, careful with its phrasing, as if each word had been weighed before being spoken. They explained that a review had been completed, documentation had been examined, patterns had been identified. Nothing in their tone suggested surprise. That steadiness told me more than the words themselves. They asked me to come in the following morning to bring identification and any records I had. I agreed and wrote the time down neatly on the corner of an envelope. After the call ended, I did not move right away. I sat there, hands resting on the table, feeling the familiar surface beneath my palms. There was no sense of victory, no relief, only a calm awareness that something I had carried quietly was about to be spoken aloud by someone else. When truth leaves your mouth and enters another's, it changes shape. It becomes less personal, more solid. The next morning, I dressed with the same care I used for doctor visits. Simple, clean, unremarkable. I left James resting at home, told him I had errands to run. He smiled and told me to take my time. I drove slowly, letting traffic pass, giving myself space to think. The building I entered was modern and cool, glass and steel reflecting a sky that looked indifferent to everything below it. Inside, the air smelled faintly of paper and something sharp, perhaps cleaning solution. I was shown into a small room and asked to sit. They laid out the documents one by one, statements, authorizations, records of access, dates aligned with locations, times aligned with transactions. Seeing it all arranged so neatly felt different from reviewing it alone at my table. Here, it was no longer a private burden, it was a sequence. They explained calmly that while the card was in my name, usage had been traced, patterns established that did not align with its stated purpose. They spoke about liability, about responsibility, about next steps. I listened, asking only when something was unclear. I did not interrupt. I did not defend. There was nothing to defend. I had not done this. Then they showed me something I had not seen before, a document with a familiar signature, not mine, an authorization added without my presence, justified under household access. My daughter-in-law's name appeared where it should not have been. I felt my chest tighten briefly, not with shock, but with confirmation. So this was how it had been done, quietly, confidently, with the assumption that no one would look too closely. I thanked them for explaining. Gratitude felt appropriate. Clarity deserves acknowledgement. Before I left, they explained what would happen next. Accounts would be frozen temporarily. A formal inquiry would proceed. They used careful language, neutral language. They did not say what this meant for Chloe. They did not need to. I understood enough. I signed where they indicated, my handwriting stay. When I stepped back outside, the light seemed brighter than before, not warmer, just sharper. I stood for a moment, letting it settle on my face, then walked to my car. I did not go straight home. I drove instead to a place I had not visited in years, a small office tucked between other businesses that had changed names more than once. Inside, the furniture was old but clean, the walls lined with files. I waited quietly until my name was called. The conversation there was shorter, more direct. Documents were reviewed again, this time from a different angle. Property records, legal boundaries, what was mine, what was not, what access implied and what it did not. I listened, absorbing each distinction. There is comfort in definitions when emotions blur everything else. By the time I returned home, the house was quiet. James was asleep on the couch, a blanket pulled up to his chest. I watched him for a moment, feeling the familiar mix of tenderness and responsibility. I did not wake him. I made tea and sat at the table, the chair creaking softly as I settled in. My phone buzzed once, then again. Messages from Chloe, short at first, asking if I had heard from the bank. I did not respond. Silence for once felt honest. Later that evening, she came home earlier than usual. I heard the door close with more force than necessary. Her footsteps were quick, uneven. She entered the kitchen and stopped when she saw me sitting there. Her face was tight, her eyes bright with something close to panic. She asked me what I had done, not asked really, accused. I looked at her and told her I had answered questions when they were asked, that I had provided records when requested. That was all. She spoke quickly then, words tumbling over each other. She said there had been misunderstandings, that she meant to tell me that everything would have worked out if I had waited. I listened without interrupting. When she finished, I told her quietly that waiting had been what I had done for a long time. I told her that the card had been opened for a specific purpose, and that purpose had been ignored. She said I was overreacting, that families handle things internally, that involving others was a betrayal. The word hung between us, betrayal. I wondered how easily it was used by those who believe it belongs only to them. James stirred on the couch, sensing raised voices, even though we had not raised them much. He sat up slowly, his confusion on his face. Chloe turned to him immediately, her tone changing, softening, explaining that there had been a mistake, that things were being sorted out. He looked at me then, searching. I met his eyes and nodded once, a small reassurance. I told him we would talk later. He nodded back, trusting me, though uncertainty flickered across his face. Chloe's phone buzzed. She looked at the screen, her color draining slightly. She stepped away to answer, lowering her voice. I did not strain to listen. I did not need to. When she returned, she gathered her things with hurried movements, avoiding my gaze. She said she needed to make some calls to fix this. I told her calmly that some things cannot be fixed once they are seen clearly. She did not respond. The door closed behind her with a sound that echoed longer than it should have. That night, James and I sat together in the quiet. He asked me what was happening. I told him the truth, carefully, without embellishment. I told him about the card, the usage, the review. I did not tell him everything, not yet. His face tightened as he listened, hurt and disbelief mixing slowly. He did not speak for a long time. When he did, his voice was low. He asked if it was serious. I told him yes. That word felt heavy, but it was accurate. As I went to bed later, my phone lay silent beside me. I knew it would not stay that way. Questions would come, consequences would follow. What had been quiet for so long was quiet no more. I turned off the light and lay still, aware that the story had shifted into a new shape. The truth was no longer contained within me. It was moving outward now, steady and unavoidable, and whatever it touched would not remain the same. The following days unfolded without drama, which surprised me. I had expected raised voices, slammed doors, something loud enough to match the weight of what had been set in motion. Instead, there was a measured stillness, the kind that follows a decision already made. Chloe did not return the next morning. Her things remained where she had left them, scattered reminders of a life that had moved quickly through our rooms. James noticed, of course. He asked where she was, and I told him she needed time to sort things out. That was true, though incomplete. He nodded, accepting it the way he had accepted so much lately. Calls began to come in, some from unfamiliar numbers, others from people I recognized only vaguely. I answered a few, listened politely, then said little. There were apologies offered on Chloe's behalf, suggestions that this could all be smoothed over, requests for patience. I responded calmly, repeating that I was cooperating with a process already underway. That phrase became my anchor. It allowed no argument, it implied no hostility, it simply stated reality. When the calls became more insistent, I stopped answering. Silence, used carefully, can say what explanations cannot. James struggled quietly. I could see it in the way he held his shoulders and how often he stared at nothing. One evening, he asked me if I had known this would happen. I told him I had known something was wrong, not how it would end. He absorbed that, his jaw tightening slightly. He did not blame me. That mattered more to me than I could easily say. He asked if Chloe would be all right. I told him she would have to take responsibility for herself now. Saying it aloud made it real. Responsibility is a lonely thing when you are not used to carrying it. A formal letter arrived 2 days later, its language careful and exact. I read it once, then again, then placed it in the folder where the others were kept. James did not ask to see it. I did not offer. We existed side by side in a shared quiet, each of us processing in our own way. At night, I heard him moving in his room, sometimes pacing, sometimes sitting still for long stretches. I did not intrude. Grief has its own rhythm. So does disillusionment. When Chloe finally came back to collect some of her belongings, it was brief. She did not look at me directly. Her movements were efficient, stripped of the confidence she once carried so easily. James stood nearby, uncertain, his presence both an offering and a boundary. She spoke to him softly, avoiding specifics, promising explanations later. He nodded, though his eyes were tired. When she turned toward me, there was something in her expression that might have been anger or fear or both. She said nothing, neither did I. Words would not have helped. The door closed behind her without ceremony. After she left, the house felt lighter, though not happier. There is a difference. Lightness comes from the absence of tension, not the presence of joy. James sat at the table, his hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had long since cooled. He asked me if I regretted what I had done. I considered the question carefully before answering. I told him I regretted that it had been necessary. I did not regret choosing honesty. He nodded slowly, as if testing the idea, then let out a breath he had been holding. That moment felt like a turning point, quiet but decisive. In the days that followed, routines reestablished themselves. James attended appointments, I cooked simple meals. We spoke more, though not always about what had happened. Sometimes we talked about small things, sometimes about the future in cautious terms. The uncertainty did not vanish, but it softened. The world outside continued, indifferent and steady. That steadiness was a comfort. Occasionally I thought of Chloe, not with satisfaction, not with bitterness, mostly with a distant sadness. I wondered how easily lines had been crossed, how confidently assumptions had been made. I wondered if she had ever believed she would be held accountable. These thoughts passed through me without staying. Holding on to them would have required energy I no longer wished to spend. One afternoon, as I sorted through the last of the paperwork, I realized how much space it had taken, not just physically but emotionally. Closing the folder felt symbolic, though I did not dwell on it. I placed it where it belonged and returned to the living room, where James was reading by the window. Light filtered in, soft and even, touching everything without judgment. I sat down beside him, and for a while we said nothing at all. That evening, as I prepared dinner, I noticed how natural the movements felt, how unburdened. The clatter of dishes, the quiet hum of the stove, the ordinary sounds of a home settling into itself. These were not victories to announce. They were signs of separation completed, of something ended without spectacle. As we ate together, I felt a calm certainty settle in. The hardest part was behind us. What lay ahead would not be easy, but it would be honest. And honesty, I was learning, brings with it a quiet strength that does not need to prove itself to anyone. Life did not return to what it had been before. I would not have wanted it to. What came instead was quieter, more deliberate, shaped by fewer assumptions. James continued to heal, not just in body, but in ways that were harder to name. He began taking longer walks, sometimes alone, sometimes with me. We spoke more honestly than we ever had, not because we forced ourselves to, but because there was no longer anything pressing us into silence. Trust, once shaken, does not rebuild itself quickly, but it can find new forms. Ours became simpler. We checked in with each other. We listened. The house adjusted too. Chloe's absence left empty spaces, but those spaces did not echo. They simply existed, waiting to be filled with something else or left as they were. I donated some items she had left behind, packed others away carefully, not out of sentiment, but out of respect for closure. I did not look through her things. That part of the story was no longer mine to examine. Letting go, I discovered, is often less dramatic than holding on. It is a series of small decisions made quietly, without witnesses. Financial matters resolved themselves over time through processes I followed patiently. I learned to ask questions without apology. I learned to read documents without fear. The numbers, once so intimidating, became manageable when faced directly. There was no sense of triumph in this, only relief. I had not reclaimed anything that was not already mine. I had simply stopped allowing it to be taken without consent. That distinction mattered to me. It kept bitterness from taking root. James eventually made decisions of his own. He chose distance, not out of anger, but out of self-preservation. I supported him without guiding him. Watching your child step into clarity, even painful clarity, is both difficult and affirming. It reminds you that they are not an extension of you, but a person learning in their own time. We did not speak of Chloe often. When we did, it was with restraint, acknowledging what had been without rewriting it. I found myself returning to small pleasures I had neglected: morning light through the window, tea held between warm hands, the rhythm of simple chores done without interruption. These moments felt earned, not because I had suffered, but because I had chosen not to turn away from what was real. There is dignity in that choice, one I had underestimated for much of my life. People sometimes ask how I managed to stay calm through everything. I do not know how to answer them fully. Calm was not something I decided on. It arrived after exhaustion had burned away the need to perform. When you stop trying to be understood by everyone, a great deal of noise falls away. What remains is not indifference, but clarity. Clarity does not rush. It waits until you are ready to see. I no longer felt the need to explain myself, not to friends, not to distant relatives, not even to memories that once replayed themselves uninvited. I had done what was necessary, not what was dramatic. The difference mattered. There was no reconciliation, and I did not mourn that. Some relationships end not with anger, but with understanding. Understanding that certain distances are not failures, but boundaries discovered too late to ignore. One afternoon, as I tended to the small plants by the window, I noticed how steady my hands were. That steadiness felt symbolic, though I did not linger on it. Symbols are useful, but they are not the point. The point was that I felt at home in myself again. That sense of belonging does not come from others. It is built slowly, through choices that align with your values rather than your fears. James joined me later, standing quietly beside me, looking out at the yard. He thanked me then, not for what I had done, but for how I had done it, for not turning our lives into something louder than it needed to be. I told him there was nothing to thank me for. Protecting yourself is not an act of aggression, it is an act of care. As the seasons shifted, I felt no urge to look back. The past remained where it belonged, acknowledged but no longer consulted. I had learned that peace is not the absence of conflict, but the presence of self-respect. That lesson, once learned, does not leave you. It settles in, shaping your days quietly. If there is anything I carry forward from all of this, it is the understanding that love does not require self-erasure, care does not demand silence, and age does not disqualify you from choosing differently when something no longer feels right. I live now with fewer expectations and more awareness. That feels like freedom. The house is quiet tonight. James is reading in the other room. I am sitting at the same table where this story began, but it does not feel the same. The weight is gone. What remains is steady, honest, and enough.